What if I told you there's a family tree in America's forgotten backwoods that no historian wants to touch? A lineage so rotten that the roots themselves drip with blood and silence. What if I told you the FBI has the files, the state has the records, and yet no one dares whisper the name aloud in the open? Tonight, you'll hear what they buried in archives, sealed for decades, because they knew once the truth was out, it could never be unheard. It begins in the deep winter of 1946. The snow in Appalachia was heavy, silent, suffocating. But inside one farmhouse, rotting at the beams, windows dark like staring eyes, a story was about to surface that would shatter generations. A father, 7 daughters. A sin so profound, it carried forward into children, grandchildren, and entire hidden communities. They called it a cold case. That is a lie. This was never cold. It was burning beneath the surface, waiting to ignite. When state agents cracked open the Blackwood files, what they found wasn't just evidence of crimes. It was evidence of a philosophy, a doctrine, a hidden creed practiced behind locked doors where no lawman dared go. This was not madness. This was a system. The man at its center believed he was chosen to purify, chosen to outlast the corruption of the outside world. And for that, his daughters were his altar, his children, his sacrifice. But ask yourself, how does a single man pull off a secret of this scale, lasting decades, spanning states, hidden in plain sight? It wasn't just him. He had allies, silent sheriffs, clerks who looked away, neighbors who heard screams and said nothing. What festers in isolation becomes monstrous, yes, but what festers in silence, under the protection of institutions sworn to defend the weak, becomes unstoppable. This story is not about incest. It is not about depravity alone. It's about how corruption shields evil, how forgotten corners of this country become breeding grounds for experiments in control, in obedience, in domination. A single family became a cult became a lineage, and that lineage may not be gone. Stay with me, because once you see what the state uncovered in 46, you'll understand why the files were sealed for 30 years, and why some men whisper that descendants of Blackwood walk among us even now, carrying blood that should never have existed. The first official trace of the Blackwoods appears in 1903, nothing more than a property deed. But look closer, and you'll see the deception was already in play. A man named Thomas Blackwood walked into a county office with cash, a small fortune, no one knew from where. He bought nearly 500 acres of wilderness in West Virginia. He didn't haggle, he didn't explain. He paid twice the asking price on one condition: no questions about his past. The clerk who handled the papers left notes, hidden for decades. He described Blackwood as a man who filled the room with his presence. Intimidating, cold. His wife, Martha, signed the documents with only an X. Couldn't write her own name, or wasn't allowed to. And then there were the daughters, 7 of them, ages 4 through 16, all silent, all obedient. Not one spoke a word in public that day. Within months they built a massive farmhouse, without local labor, without neighbors ever seeing who carried the stone, who hoisted the beams. Blackwood collected supplies alone, hauling iron stoves and timber by himself. Impossible, yet recorded. Storekeepers scribbled notes in ledgers. How does he carry such weight? Others wondered if the daughters labored in secret, hidden from view. No one pressed, and that silence would become the soil from which horror grew. For 3 years, not a single neighbor saw the women. Not a single letter passed through the post addressed to the daughters. Only Thomas appeared at the edge of the property, intercepting every delivery, controlling every interaction, a wall of secrecy, a fortress of silence. Then came the first crack in the facade. 1907. A postal carrier noted something odd. From the barn, he heard crying, not the thin wail of a calf, but the sobbing of a woman in pain. Blackwood smiled and explained it away, but the man knew the sound of human agony. He wrote it down in his journal. "Hello, something is wrong up there." But again, nothing was done. The county sheriff never asked questions. Why? Because Blackwood donated generously to his re-election campaign. He gave money to local charities run by commissioners. He bought silence. He bought blind eyes. And in doing so, he created a kingdom with no outside interference. This is how evil survives, not because it hides well, but because men with power choose to look away. The Blackwoods weren't invisible, they were untouchable. Winter of 1908. The storm was thick, blinding the mountain paths, when a horse-drawn carriage pushed its way toward the Blackwood farmhouse. Inside sat Dr. Samuel Porter, summoned for what he assumed was a routine delivery, a mother in labor. But when he entered the farmhouse, the first thing he noticed was silence. Not the silence of reverence, not the quiet of a home, but something heavy, suffocating. He expected to see Martha, the matriarch, pale and sweating on a birthing bed. Instead, he found Catherine, the eldest daughter, 21 years old. The fear in her eyes was unmistakable. Her hands trembled, her breath shallow, but it wasn't the labor that terrified her. It was the presence of her father, standing at the foot of the bed like a priest at an altar. Porter examined her. His notes, sealed for nearly 60 years, revealed something unspeakable. This was not her first pregnancy, and yet there was no record of her marriage, no sign of a husband. When the doctor cautiously asked about the father, Thomas Blackwood's demeanor shifted, cold fury, a warning unspoken but sharp as a blade. Your duty is to the patient, nothing more. But what struck Porter deepest wasn't Blackwood's hostility. It was Catherine's reaction. When her father entered the room, her entire body stiffened. She trembled, not with the relief a child feels when a parent arrives, but with dread. Pure, conditioned terror. Behind her, in the hallway shadows, the doctor glimpsed them. 6 other young women, watching. All daughters, all silent. At least 2 were visibly pregnant. Their faces pale, their eyes lifeless. He tried to speak to them. Blackwood stepped forward, blocking his path, and ordered him from the house the moment the infant, a healthy boy, was delivered. Porter recorded the event in his journal. This house is not a home. It is a breeding ground. These women are prisoners in silence, and something is gravely wrong, but the law does not reach this mountain. He sent a quiet word to the sheriff. The sheriff came, looked around, spoke to Blackwood, and left. The official report. Family private. No cause for concern. Just 3 sentences. That was all the law would say. This was the first undeniable proof of something unholy taking root, and yet nothing was done. The doctor's notes were buried, sealed away. The silence tightened its grip. 1 child born, 7 daughters under command, and a father convinced he was building something greater than a family, a dynasty of blood. Autumn. The leaves in Appalachia were burning red and gold when a hunter named Jonas Miller wandered too far along the ridge. He moved through the brush, chasing deer tracks until he stumbled upon something that froze him in place. A cemetery. Crude. Hidden. Shallow. 11 graves marked only with wooden crosses. No names. No words. Only dates. Some of the mounds were small. Too small. Children. Infants. Miller knew what he had found. He rode back into town, pale and trembling, and reported it to Sheriff Taylor. The sheriff listened, leaned back in his chair, and then dismissed it with a single line. Whatever the Blackwoods do on their own land is their business. family burials are no crime. And with that, the discovery was buried as deep as the bodies themselves. But the cracks were widening. The drought of 1911 forced the Blackwoods out of isolation. Streams dried up, wells turned to dust. They had to travel further to find water. And in that desperate stretch, something unexpected happened. Elizabeth Blackwood, the youngest daughter, just 16, crossed paths with a traveling Bible salesman named George Hartford. Hartford would later describe her as a ghost in daylight. Shy, pale, eyes darting like a frightened animal. She begged him for books, not money, not food. Books, but with one demand: never tell her father. And so it began. They exchanged letters hidden beneath a rock formation at the property's edge. At first they were simple, requests for stories, scriptures, scraps of knowledge. But over weeks, the tone changed. Elizabeth began confessing what life inside the Blackwood farmhouse truly was. She wrote, "Father says the outside world is poisoned, that God chose him to make a pure bloodline. When each sister turns 13, she is taken to the East Wing, the special room. That is when she must fulfill her purpose. Mother tried to stop it once. He locked her underground until her voice broke. She never spoke against him again." The letters grew darker. Elizabeth revealed that infants often did not survive. The sickness, she called it. The ones who died were buried in the secret graveyard Miller had found, and the survivors, pale, weak, trembling, were being raised to continue the cycle. But her last letter was the one that burned. "Father prepares my nephew Thomas Jr. to take his place. He says the bloodline must never break. If you hear nothing from me by May, call the state, not the sheriff. He has already been bought." Hartford never heard from her again. Spring 1912. The drought broke, but the silence around the Blackwood farm did not. George Hartford, the Bible salesman, grew restless. He waited, returned to the rock where Elizabeth once left her desperate letters, but nothing came. He tried again and again. Still nothing. And then, on his fourth visit, he found something chilling. Not a letter, but a blood-stained scrap of cloth pressed beneath the stone. He rode to Charleston, bypassing the county entirely, and handed Elizabeth's letters to a state investigator named Richard Calloway. Calloway was young, ambitious, and unafraid of ruffling feathers. He read the letters, each darker than the last, and knew at once that he had stumbled onto something more than family eccentricity. This was organized, generational cruelty. But when Calloway requested cooperation from the local sheriff's office, he hit the same brick wall Hartford had warned about. Sheriff Taylor not only dismissed the matter, he mocked it. A young girl's wild stories. "Do you know how many tales I hear about devils, ghosts, and curses in these hills? You'd clog the whole state docket if you listened to every spooked teenager." Calloway didn't listen. He rode out himself, taking Hartford as a witness. They traveled by horse through miles of tangled brush and muddy hills until the Blackwood house emerged at dusk, a towering, sagging structure with darkened windows like sockets in a skull. He knocked. The door creaked open just enough for a face to appear. It was Thomas Blackwood himself. Thin, towering, his beard streaked with white, his eyes burning with a fanatic's glare. Calloway announced his purpose, but before he finished his sentence, Blackwood slammed the door shut. Minutes later, a boy appeared at the edge of the porch, small, sickly, pale as bone. He stared at Calloway and Hartford without saying a word, then retreated back inside. That image haunted Calloway long after they left. He filed his first report that same night. The Blackwood family maintains deliberate isolation. Children appear frail and malnourished. Adult patriarch hostile. suspect abuse, incest, and concealment of deaths. But then, his report vanished. The file never made it past the county clerk's desk. A week later, Hartford returned to Calloway's office in Charleston to find it ransacked. Papers missing, the Blackwood letters gone, and Calloway himself vanished. His desk cold, his bed unslept in. The last trace of him was a message scratched into the back of his office door, 3 words carved deep into the wood. East Wing. Children. Summer, 1913. The whispers had grown too loud to ignore. Calloway's disappearance had become a rumor that even Charleston officials couldn't silence, and with Hartford pressing the state relentlessly, a small task force was finally assembled to investigate the Blackwood property. 4 men, armed with warrants, rifles, and lanterns, rode into the hills. Hartford stayed behind. He claimed a broken leg from a fall, but the truth was simpler. He was terrified. He told the captain, "If you enter that house, you won't come back the same." The men laughed, but uneasily. The ride up was brutal. Mud sucked at their boots, the forest pressed in like a living wall, and every step toward the ridge felt heavier. But by dusk, they reached the clearing. The Blackwood house stood waiting, massive, rotting, its windows black and watchful. Smoke curled from its crooked chimney. The officers knocked. Silence. They knocked again, harder. Still silence. Finally, the captain ordered the door broken. The men pushed through, rifles raised, lanterns swinging. The air inside was wet, stale, and thick with the odor of rot. The entry hall was lined with portraits, faces of Blackwood's long dead, painted in grim detail. But what unsettled them most wasn't the art. It was that every pair of eyes in those portraits had been scratched out. They advanced down the hall, the floorboards groaning. From the east wing came the sound, soft, deliberate, a child's lullaby, sung off-key. They followed it. The east wing door was bolted from the outside. The men exchanged looks. If it was locked from this side, it wasn't meant to keep intruders out. It was meant to keep something in. The captain unlatched it. The stench that poured out was unbearable. Inside, the lanterns revealed rows of crude wooden cribs, some occupied, some empty. In the cribs lay children, but not like any children the men had ever seen, and pale, hollow-eyed. Some were too old for cribs, their limbs twisted, their bodies trembling as if unable to hold themselves up. And in the corner, Elizabeth, or what was left of her, gaunt, hair hanging in clumps. She whispered something over and over again, rocking back and forth. The captain leaned in to hear. "He comes at night. He comes at night. He comes at night." That was when the back door slammed. Heavy boots pounded the hallway. A voice thundered through the house, the voice of Thomas Blackwood. "You've seen what was never meant for outsiders' eyes." Gunshots cracked in the dark. Screams followed. By morning, only 2 officers stumbled back into town, clothes torn, faces white as death. Their report was brief, almost incoherent. The final line read, "East Wing is not of this earth. Do not return." The survivors of that raid, Deputy Lang and Officer Harker, were never the same. Lang left the force within a month. He took work as a ferryman along the Ohio River, but locals whispered that he rarely spoke a word, and when he did, it was only to mutter prayers under his breath. Harker fared worse. He was found months later, dead in his boarding house room, a revolver in hand, and 3 words written across the wall in his own blood: "They still sing." The official report of the raid never surfaced. What the public got instead was a brief notice in the Charleston Gazette. Routine inspection of the Blackwood property found no cause for alarm. Family remains in seclusion by choice. No further action required. That was the lie. Behind closed doors, state officials argued bitterly. Some wanted to intervene again, to bring the children out. to arrest Thomas Blackwood for crimes too obvious to ignore. But others, politicians with stakes in the county, men whose campaigns had been bankrolled by Blackwood's hidden fortune, warned against it. Disturbing those people would stir something best left buried, one senator was quoted as saying. The hills are full of mad stories. Do not turn madness into politics. So the files were sealed. The photographs, if any existed, were destroyed. The state's silence became another wall around the Blackwood house. And in that silence, the family thrived. Through the 1910s and into the 1920s, their land grew. Neighbors reported seeing fences moved further into the woods, as if the Blackwoods were swallowing acres whole. Hunters swore they heard crying in the night, drifting down from the ridge. And yet, when they climbed to investigate, they always found the woods eerily still, as if sound itself avoided the farmhouse. Elizabeth was never seen again. Hartford, the one man who tried to save her, drank himself to death in a boarding house on the edge of Charleston in 1918. His last words, muttered deliriously to a priest, were, "They'll outlive us all. He said the bloodline is forever." But the most chilling sign came in 1923, when travelers passing through the valley reported a strange procession on the ridge. A line of pale figures barefoot, moving silently under torchlight. At their head, taller than all the rest, was Thomas Blackwood, and in his arms, swaddled tightly, was a newborn child. The witness swore the infant did not cry, not once. The Blackwoods had survived the raid, and now, shielded by the state's silence, they were preparing to expand their legacy of horror. The 1930s, a decade of hunger, dust, and desperation. While most of Appalachia buckled under the Great Depression, the Blackwoods did not starve. Their crops withered like everyone else's, yet they never begged, never bartered. Somehow, they endured. But with survival came a new, more terrifying strategy. For the first time in nearly a century, the Blackwood children were seen leaving the ridge. Not alone, never alone, but in pairs, escorted by older family members. They traveled on foot into nearby towns, slipping through alleys and markets like shadows. They bought supplies in bulk, salt, candles, medicinal herbs, and they never spoke, not a word. Shopkeepers began to notice something uncanny. The children never met anyone's eyes. Their skin was almost translucent, their lips colorless. When coins were handed over, the children flinched as if touched by fire. One shopkeeper swore he caught a boy whispering to himself in a language that sounded ancient, guttural, something not of these hills, not of this century. Then came the disappearances. In 1932, a schoolteacher named Margaret Price vanished while walking home from the one-room schoolhouse just outside the county line. Her body was never found, but scraps of her clothing surfaced near the ridge, snagged on bramble as if dragged. A year later, 2 traveling salesmen were reported missing after taking the mountain road toward Blackwood territory. Their car was later discovered abandoned, doors wide open as if they'd stepped out willingly and never returned. Locals began whispering about the sending out, that Thomas Blackwood was no longer content to keep his brood hidden, that he was planting them like seeds into the wider world. One rumor claimed that children were being paired with outsiders, forced into marriages under threat, ensuring the bloodline spread beyond the farm. Another, darker story suggested that not all the Blackwood children returned from their journeys, that some were traded, bartered, or sacrificed in rituals meant to preserve the family's twisted vitality. By 1935, the state had received no fewer than 17 anonymous letters demanding action. But the officials, as before, turned their faces away. The Depression gave them an excuse. Too many hungry mouths to worry about one family of hill people. Yet behind that excuse lay the same truth that had haunted Charleston for decades. The Blackwoods had protection, and the family knew it. Witnesses described the patriarch, Thomas, now an old man with white hair and hollow cheeks, standing at the edge of his property, smiling as the children slipped into the woods. His voice carried across the valley. The world is our cradle now. By the late 1930s, reports began surfacing, strange, fragmented, often dismissed as rumor, of pale, silent children appearing in towns miles from the Appalachians. A boy seen in a Tennessee hospital ward, an oddly quiet girl in a Kentucky orphanage, 2 children in a North Carolina mill town who spoke only to each other in that guttural, indecipherable tongue. Local authorities shrugged. Orphans, they said. Family runaways. And yet the patterns were unmistakable. These were not ordinary children. Their eyes, wide and unblinking, reflected something older than memory, something honed by decades of isolation and strict control. They never laughed. They rarely cried. And when approached, their bodies stiffened, hands curling instinctively toward themselves, as if guarding a secret no outsider could touch. A nurse in Chattanooga recorded her encounter. The boy clutched a small journal, repeating prayers in a language I could not understand. He flinched when I tried to touch him. There was fear in his eyes, fear of something, someone I could not see. And then the whispers began. Stories of children disappearing from institutions, reappearing days or weeks later, speaking of the mountain, of a tall man with white hair, watching. Sometimes they were sent back alone, carrying messages for other Blackwoods. Prepare. The bloodline continues. Watch for the next. Do not fail. The pattern was clear. Thomas Blackwood's reach had grown. His children, once confined to the ridge, were now emissaries, planting the seeds of his obsession into the world. Every town where they appeared was later linked to another disappearance, another strange pregnancy, another silent child born into secrecy. Even psychologists sent to study them were confounded. Tests could not explain their cognition. Their behavior was not just abnormal, it was trained, conditioned, a product of decades of indoctrination. And when these children were questioned about family or origin, they would only whisper one name: Father. By 1940, the trail of the Blackwood descendants formed a loose network across 4 states. The original mountain had become a hub, a command center from which the patriarch orchestrated a living experiment in isolation, indoctrination, and bloodline preservation. And yet, the authorities remained unaware. The veil of secrecy had grown so thick that even the most diligent investigators could not pierce it. Until 1946, when a routine bank inventory uncovered a safety deposit box rented decades earlier, containing maps, new identities, and a chilling letter that revealed the scope of Blackwood's ambition. The letter began, "Whoever finds this, know that the divine bloodline lives. We have spread like seeds through the land, unseen, undisturbed, and the work continues. The world is ours, if we remain hidden." It was the first undeniable proof that the Blackwood nightmare had not ended with the Appalachians. It had only begun. Charleston, West Virginia. A dusty, gray summer afternoon. The routine inventory of unclaimed safety deposit boxes at the First National Bank seemed mundane until the clerk turned a key and opened box 314. Inside lay a collection of papers that would shock the nation and horrify anyone who believed in the limits of human depravity. Maps. Detailed diagrams of remote properties in Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina, all purchased under false names. Documents creating new identities for each of Thomas Blackwood's daughters and their children, and at the center, a letter addressed to whoever discovers this. The handwriting was deliberate, almost clinical, yet dripping with mania. My divine lineage will continue undetected. Each daughter, each son, each seed of our blood spreads across the states. We are God's chosen. We will outlive the corrupt, the weak, the outside world that fails to comprehend true purity. State investigators immediately traced the properties. What they discovered was terrifying. The network was vast, organized, and precise. Each location mirrored the original Blackwood farm, isolated, fortified, with children strictly controlled, indoctrinated, and most disturbingly, prepared to continue the bloodline in secrecy. Medical assessments revealed the toll of generations of inbreeding, severe physical deformities, cognitive impairments, and emotional detachment. Many of the descendants had never experienced normal human interaction, never understood the outside world, yet were trained in the fanatic rituals dictated by Thomas Blackwood decades earlier. By the time authorities intervened, nearly 100 individuals were located, spread across 4 states. 73 were rescued. 39 required institutional care due to severe disabilities. Some adults, still adhering to Blackwood's doctrine, were legally culpable, but most were too indoctrinated, too broken by isolation, to comprehend the law itself. And Thomas Blackwood? He was gone. The last confirmed trace was a property purchase in rural Georgia in 1932. Whether he had died, fled, or established yet another hidden enclave remained a mystery. The FBI file stayed active until 1960, but he was officially listed as presumed deceased. The 1946 discovery revealed the chilling truth. The Blackwood legacy was not confined to a single hill, a single county, or a single generation. It had metastasized, invisible, hidden, but spreading. An entire population of victims and survivors molded to preserve a dark, delusional vision of divine blood. For decades, the Blackwood descendants would live with the scars of their origin, bodies broken by genetics, minds fractured by isolation, souls haunted by an identity imposed before birth. And the world outside? Mostly unaware that a nightmare once confined to the mountains had reached across states, leaving traces of horror in unsuspecting towns. It was and remains a reminder. Some sins are too vast to vanish quietly. Some legacies are too dark to ever be forgotten. The Blackwood descendants, once extracted from the remote enclaves, arrived in Charleston under the watchful eyes of state authorities and medical experts. At first glance, it seemed like salvation, freedom from the mountains, from the oppressive control of a patriarch who claimed divine authority over every thought, every body, every soul. But freedom was a fragile concept for these children. Many could not speak beyond monosyllables. They had no understanding of age, of time, or of the ordinary rhythms of life. Food, light, sound, and touch all had been regimented, controlled, and weaponized by Thomas Blackwood. One young girl, barely 10, would only sit in a corner, rocking back and forth, whispering numbers as if they were prayers, as if counting could stave off unseen horrors. Medical examinations revealed the devastating genetic consequences of decades of incest, malformed limbs, cleft palates, weakened immune systems, and neurological impairments. Cognitive assessments were even more harrowing. Several adults in their 20s functioned at the mental level of early childhood. Memories of the world beyond the mountains were non-existent. Their entire worldview had been constructed in the claustrophobic walls of the Blackwood properties. Psychologists and social workers described patterns that would haunt them for decades. Survivors exhibited compulsive behaviors, meticulous cleaning, ritualized eating, avoidance of eye contact, and sudden, unprovoked aggression. Nightmares were universal, recurring in vivid detail: the smell of smoke, the echoing voice of Thomas, the special room in the East Wing, the cradle of pale children staring back. And yet, amid the trauma, there were glimmers of human resilience. Some learned to trust. Some discovered language, laughter, and curiosity for the first time. Foster families reported small victories: a child learning to ride a bicycle, a young adult reading a book without fear, the first tentative smile that had not been dictated by ritual or fear. But the shadow of Blackwood's doctrine lingered. Survivors would recount stories in hushed tones, often under the cover of night, of father's law, of punishments for disobedience, of the unspoken expectation to continue the bloodline. Even decades later, the psychological imprint persisted, an invisible chain binding them to a dark heritage. The 1946 rescue, while heroic in scope, did not erase the damage. Instead, it revealed a chilling reality. One man's obsession had created not just victims, but an entire microcosm of corrupted human life, stretching across states and generations. It was a horror not confined to one home, but a virus, latent and insidious, buried in the DNA and memories of those forced into Thomas Blackwood's divine experiment. And yet, the world moved on, largely unaware. The legal machinery moved cautiously, almost reluctantly. Prosecutors faced a dilemma unlike any in American history. How do you punish those who were molded from birth to obey a tyrant? How do you hold accountable minds that had never known freedom, yet committed acts deemed criminal by society? Courtrooms in Charleston became theaters of tragedy. Adults who were now in their 30s or 40s were charged with various crimes: incest, child abuse, neglect. But the defense was almost always the same: lifelong indoctrination, impossible to resist, and ignorance of the outside world. Psychologists testified for weeks, painting chilling portraits of individuals who could not distinguish morality from obedience, who believed devotion to Blackwood's doctrine was divine law. Some cases were dismissed outright. Others resulted in institutionalization rather than imprisonment, a legal recognition that the mind had been broken beyond conventional rehabilitation. Children who had been forced into pregnancies as teenagers were placed under medical care, some with irreversible physical consequences. Their siblings, trained to perpetuate the family's twisted lineage, required psychological and social rehabilitation that would last decades. Yet even within these institutions, the echoes of Blackwood's teachings persisted. Survivors whispered in corridors, taught each other rituals, passed down rules in secret. Staff reported incidents of coordinated disobedience, of sudden, unexplainable violence, of cryptic messages carved into walls and furniture. The bloodline survives, it must. And Thomas Blackwood himself remained an enigma. He was never found. Some believed he had died quietly in the mountains or in one of his secreted properties. Others feared the truth, that he had relocated, established another enclave, or even traveled beyond the states, leaving a carefully hidden blueprint for his descendants to continue his divine experiment. Every lead, every rumor, every sighting ultimately dissolved into the mountains or the mist of unrecorded roads. By the late 1940s, the case had entered American folklore as both a cautionary tale and an unsolved nightmare. Scholars of criminal psychology cited it as one of the most extreme examples of multi-generational abuse and indoctrination. Geneticists later used the Blackwood lineage as a harrowing case study in the effects of isolation, inbreeding, and the compounding of trauma across generations. And yet, beyond the papers, beyond the courtrooms, the survivors carried the true story in their bodies, their minds, their very DNA. The horror was not over. It had only been redistributed. The Blackwood legacy, once concentrated in a single, remote farm, had now spread into the wider world. The mountains had released their ghosts. The question that haunted investigators, psychologists, and historians alike: if one man could orchestrate such darkness in secret, how many others might be out there, hidden in plain sight, shaping generations with unseen hands? Decades later, psychologists revisiting the Blackwood case uncovered patterns that still defy explanation. Survivors, now adults, spoke of recurring dreams, visions of the farmhouse, the special room, the rigid schedules, the silent corridors where whispers of obedience never ceased. Even those raised in foster homes and supportive families reported compulsive behaviors, extreme ritualism, hyper-awareness of others' movements, and a near-obsessive desire to catalog their surroundings. Researchers noted one terrifying pattern. The indoctrination Thomas Blackwood implemented did not simply vanish. It was encoded in the way his descendants thought, how they processed fear and authority, how they viewed family, blood, and loyalty. Some adults, when confronted with moral decisions, defaulted to obedience over reason, instinctively deferring to hierarchies, whether real or imagined. Medical studies on the surviving descendants revealed something equally disturbing. Many carried genetic markers of long-term inbreeding, congenital disorders, facial deformities, and diminished cognitive flexibility. But more insidious was the emotional imprint. Survivors described a compulsion to reproduce within trusted circles, an echo of Blackwood's obsessive preservation of bloodlines. Even without direct coercion, the doctrine persisted like a ghost, transmitted through memory, conditioning, and coded familial instruction. Historians and sociologists began to realize the broader implications. Thomas Blackwood had created not just victims, but an intergenerational system, an invisible, self-perpetuating network designed to survive beyond his life. His control had extended beyond isolation, beyond fear. It had mutated into something structural, resilient, and terrifyingly adaptive. Some descendants integrated into society, slowly learning the rules of a world they were never meant to inhabit. Others vanished into secrecy, retreating to rural enclaves, carrying fragments of doctrine with them. Reports in the 1960s and 70s hinted at small, isolated communities exhibiting ritualistic behaviors eerily similar to the original Blackwood methods. Authorities never connected the dots. The ultimate horror. Thomas Blackwood's plan had succeeded in ways even he might not have predicted. His original experiment, the creation of a pure lineage, had metastasized across time and space. The bloodline endured, carrying the physical, psychological, and ideological consequences of decades-long abuse, hidden in plain sight, waiting for the next observer, the next investigator, the next historian to uncover its chilling truth. And for those who hear this story, consider this. The mountains may have hidden the Blackwoods, but the principles of control, indoctrination, and fear they perfected can exist anywhere, in any household, in any system that isolates, disciplines, and commands obedience. The lesson is as dark as it is simple. Power corrupts, secrecy empowers, and some legacies refuse to die. By the early 1970s, the FBI assembled a specialized task force to trace the Blackwood descendants and map the shadow network Thomas had created decades earlier. Their goal: to locate every surviving property, every child, every adult who had been touched by the patriarch's obsession. What they found was worse than anyone expected. The network was sprawling. Families, once thought isolated in the Appalachian Hills, had spread into Tennessee, Kentucky, North Carolina, and beyond. Entire communities, small and unassuming, operated under the invisible hand of a doctrine written decades before, passed down through secretive rituals, coded language, and strict behavioral rules. Some descendants had never stepped outside their compound. Others had integrated into towns, cities, and workplaces, appearing ordinary while carrying the psychological residue of Blackwood's design. The medical team accompanying the investigators documented the extent of the damage. Children and adults exhibited extreme genetic anomalies, stunted growth, cognitive impairments, and facial deformities consistent with multi-generational inbreeding. More chilling were the psychological findings. Survivors displayed obsessive ritualistic behaviors, compulsions, social withdrawal, and a near-complete inability to comprehend normal family structures. But it wasn't just the physical and psychological impact that horrified the investigators, it was the doctrine. Despite decades of separation from the original farm, many descendants still adhered to the teachings. They whispered of Father's law, of divine duty, of purity and survival. Some had even attempted to recreate the special room in basements or barns, enforcing control over the next generation. It was as if Thomas Blackwood's obsession had outlived him, like a virus embedded in memory and behavior. The task force also uncovered financial record, DS, hidden documents, and maps detailing safe houses, relocation plans, and instructions for continued secrecy. It became clear that Blackwood had meticulously engineered a network capable of self-preservation. Even without his presence, his vision endured. His descendants were the carriers, the emissaries of a philosophy rooted in domination, fear, and the sanctity of bloodlines. Investigators realized a terrifying truth. The Blackwood experiment was not over. Even after decades, even after rescue, the pattern could reproduce. Anywhere isolation and indoctrination took root, anywhere secrecy was enforced, the blueprint remained. The patriarch had engineered survival not only of his bloodline, but of his ideology. It was, in the words of one FBI agent, a living, breathing legacy of horror, invisible in plain sight. The rehabilitation of Blackwood's descendants was not simply a matter of relocation or medical care. It was a confrontation with decades of indoctrination, trauma, and isolation. Psychologists, social workers, and medical professionals soon realized they were dealing with minds shaped in extreme captivity, conditioned from birth to obey a tyrant whose commands were absolute. Some adults resisted attempts at social integration entirely. They refused to speak, refused to eat without ritual, and would not separate themselves from siblings or cousins, clinging to the familial hierarchies Blackwood had instilled. Attempts to teach ordinary life, how to cook, how to navigate a grocery store, how to interact with strangers, often triggered panic attacks, seizures, or self-harming behavior. The psychological imprint of obedience and fear ran deep, almost unbreakable. Children posed an even graver challenge. Many had never known touch without authority, never felt affection that wasn't conditional, never encountered a world beyond the rules of isolation. They were hyper-vigilant, speaking in hushed tones, alert to imagined punishments. Some displayed compulsive counting, memorization of rituals, or repeating prayers that invoked Blackwood's divine law. Medical professionals documented these behaviors meticulously, but even the science struggled to grasp the full horror. Genetic anomalies, deformities, cognitive impairments, stunted growth were compounded by emotional and psychological scars. For many survivors, the body and mind were inseparable in trauma, a physical manifestation of decades of controlled breeding, fear, and ritualized obedience. Yet within this darkness, there were rare sparks of adaptation. A few individuals learned to question authority, to experiment with independent thought, to forge small bonds with caretakers. They developed subtle strategies to navigate the outside world while retaining the protective instincts their upbringing had ingrained. Slowly, painfully, they began to integrate into communities, but always with a shadow hovering over them. Even decades later, interviews with survivors revealed recurring nightmares, the echo of Thomas Blackwood's voice, the special room, the silent corridors of the original farm. Many whispered of rituals they had been forced to perform, and of instructions they felt compelled to pass on, as if his doctrine were encoded in their very DNA. The lesson was chilling. You cannot simply remove someone from darkness without confronting what that darkness has left behind. Thomas Blackwood's experiment did not end with rescue. It persisted in bodies, in minds, in habits, in memory. It was a legacy of fear and obedience that stretched across generations, haunting every attempt at normalcy. And for those who hear this story, consider this. Some chains are invisible, yet unbreakable. Some sins are not buried in the mountains. They live on, carried silently by those who survived. By the late 20th century, investigators, psychologists, and historians had pieced together the Blackwood legacy, a sprawling, tragic tapestry of abuse, indoctrination, and genetic collapse. But as the last survivors aged, a chilling question lingered. Had Thomas Blackwood truly vanished? Or had his work simply evolved, hidden beneath the veneer of ordinary life? The patterns were impossible to ignore. Communities in rural Appalachia, Tennessee, and Kentucky still contained families that lived with unusual secrecy, rigid hierarchies, and insular traditions. Children were often educated privately, rarely mingled with peers, and rituals, though obscured by generations of obfuscation, echoed the structure of Blackwood's original doctrines. Even decades later, some descendants reported instructions whispered at birth, insisting obedience to unseen laws, fear of outsiders, and the sanctity of bloodlines. Federal and state agencies remained cautious. Without concrete evidence, these behaviors were often dismissed as eccentricity or regional peculiarity. But researchers understood the darker truth. The Blackwood ideology had been encoded in both mind and memory, in family systems and social patterns. It was a blueprint that could survive in isolation indefinitely, ready to resurface whenever conditions allowed. Anthropologists and geneticists began to study the lineages, discovering clusters of unusual genetic anomalies, congenital disorders, and shared cognitive traits that aligned with the original Blackwood network. Though most descendants had been rescued, the pattern of isolation, indoctrination, and reproduction had left a lingering, almost invisible imprint, an echo of control that persisted silently across decades. Psychologists warned that some individuals, even unknowingly, were perpetuating the experiment, small pockets of interrelated families adhering to secrecy and ritual existed under the radar of law enforcement. Survivors occasionally spoke of relatives who refused intervention, who maintained coded instructions, or who had recreated the rules in remote homesteads. The terror was not only historical, it was alive, quiet, and watchful. And the most disturbing thought, Thomas Blackwood may have inspired more than just bloodlines. His model of control, isolation, and indoctrination had the potential to manifest anywhere secrecy and power meet obedience. What he began in a single mountain farmhouse could exist in countless places without notice, quietly shaping minds, bodies, and generations. For the observer, the lesson is unmistakable. Evil does not always die with its creator. Some legacies are designed to survive, invisible in plain sight, waiting for the next generation to carry the torch, or to recognize the horror and break it forever. The most insidious aspect of Thomas Blackwood's legacy wasn't the physical abuse, nor even the calculated inbreeding. It was the system of psychological control he embedded into every aspect of his daughters' lives. Every routine, every rule, every whispered instruction was a tool designed to shape obedience, fear, and a rigid understanding of the world. Survivor accounts, corroborated by letters and the rare journal entries of Thomas himself, describe daily rituals that were enforced with relentless precision. Children were made to recite prayers and scriptures of his own invention, often for hours at a time. Any hesitation, any deviation, brought punishment, sometimes physical, sometimes psychological, but always designed to erode independent thought. The infamous special room functioned as both a symbol and an instrument of control. It was a place where obedience was codified, where the hierarchy of power was made absolute. Each daughter, upon reaching puberty, was brought there under the guise of divine duty, where Thomas meticulously recorded behaviors, compliance, and fertility. The room was a stage upon which terror and reverence coexisted, conditioning the mind to equate fear with devotion. Even mundane aspects of life were weaponized. Food was rationed according to performance and rituals. Sleep was scheduled with military precision. Silence was enforced except when Thomas demanded speech. Isolation from the outside world reinforced dependency. Any curiosity about society beyond the mountains was met with moral panic, threats of divine wrath, or reminders that the bloodline had a sacred purpose that outsiders could never understand. The psychological impact was profound. Fear became a constant companion, shaping every decision and action. Obedience was internalized, a reflex rather than a choice. Over time, the children developed an almost instinctual deference, a compulsion to comply even in the absence of threat. Survivors later described feeling as though their thoughts were never entirely their own, as though a hidden authority dictated responses, impulses, and emotions. And yet, Blackwood's system was not solely about fear. It incorporated reward, ritual, and affirmation, binding compliance to perceived purpose. His daughters were taught that obedience was divine, that participation in his experiment was noble, that their suffering had meaning beyond comprehension. In this way, control became self-sustaining. The children internalized the ideology, making rebellion psychologically almost impossible. This was the genius and the horror of Thomas Blackwood. He didn't just abuse. He built minds to perpetuate the abuse, creating a network of thought, behavior, and belief that could survive generations. The true horror of Thomas Blackwood's influence is not only in the acts he committed, but in how those acts molded the very identity of his descendants. Survivors describe a sense of self that was fractured, simultaneously human and engineered, natural and dictated, a dual existence imposed by decades of ritualized obedience and indoctrination. Even after rescue, children and adults carried the invisible chains of his authority. They described themselves as watchers of the world, perpetually scanning for signs of danger, alert to imagined moral failings, or compelled to enact behaviors learned decades earlier. Ordinary experiences, school, community, friendship, felt unnatural, threatening, or morally corrupt. Their sense of normalcy had been redefined within the rigid framework of Blackwood's commandments. Identity had been weaponized. Each daughter, and later each grandchild, was trained to believe that compliance was sacred, that deviation was catastrophic, and that their entire existence was a function of a higher, divine purpose. Fear, devotion, and learned helplessness became the scaffolding of personality. Even those who escaped the mountains carried the imprint of terror into adulthood, shaping relationships, trust, and emotional resilience. Many survivors reported recurring compulsion-like behaviors, secret journaling of sins, private ritualized movements, counting, whispering prayers, or revisiting the memory of the special room in their minds as a form of unconscious obedience. Their mental landscapes were maps of control, marked by invisible rules they could not entirely discard. Some adults attempted to consciously rebel, to forge a self apart from Blackwood's shadow, but the psychological architecture he constructed made complete autonomy nearly impossible. Survivors described experiences akin to cognitive paralysis, knowing what was right in society, yet instinctively deferring to the internalized commands of a father who had long since vanished. It was as if the experiment had shifted from the physical realm to the mental, evolving into an enduring cognitive inheritance. Where bloodlines once carried genetic consequences, now they carried trauma, obedience, and a subtle compulsion to continue patterns that had been learned, enforced, and internalized. For the historian, the psychologist, the observer, the lesson is stark. Control can outlive its creator. Fear, obedience, and ritual can become inherited structures of identity. And some legacies, forged in cruelty and secrecy, do not die with the patriarch. They live inside the minds of those he shaped, waiting, influencing, and sometimes quietly commanding. Thomas Blackwood's control extended beyond actions and punishments. It was embedded in symbols, coded language, and rituals that transformed obedience into a second nature. Every gesture, every word, every object in the household carried meaning, a silent grammar designed to reinforce hierarchy, fear, and submission. Letters recovered from the 1910s reveal the depth of this system. Daughters wrote in symbols that seemed innocuous to outsiders, geometric marks, shorthand codes, or seemingly innocent phrases that conveyed warnings, instructions, or approval. These codes ensured secrecy, even in moments when communication was unavoidable. Outsiders, tradesmen, postal carriers, neighbors, saw nothing but ordinary notes, unaware that each letter carried layers of control and doctrine. Objects in the home were equally purposeful. The special room was not only a site of ritualized obedience, but a chamber of encoded meaning. Furniture placement, the orientation of beds, inscriptions on walls, and the use of candles and fabrics followed patterns only comprehensible to the Blackwoods. Each item reinforced Blackwood's ideology: purity, hierarchy, obedience, and the sanctity of bloodlines. Even the simplest action, such as sitting, standing, or handling an object, became a test of compliance. Survivors later described subtle ceremonies in daily life: the order of meals, the manner of speaking, the sequence of chores. Each was a lesson in hierarchy, a silent code transmitted through repetition. Disobedience was met with psychological correction, isolation, threats, or witnessing consequences for others, all designed to teach without explicit explanation. Fear became internalized as instinct, and ritual became an automatic expression of loyalty. This symbolic system also ensured the survival of doctrine across generations. Even after Thomas disappeared, the language, codes, and rituals provided a structure for his daughters and grandchildren to continue enforcing obedience and secrecy. The system didn't rely on physical presence, it relied on the mental scaffolding he had built, a blueprint for thought, perception, and behavior encoded in symbols and routines. It was, in effect, a self-perpetuating ideology, invisible to outsiders, yet omnipresent in the minds of those raised within it. And the most disturbing aspect, once internalized, it required no tyrant to enforce it. The children became both student and enforcer, carrier and custodian of a doctrine that promised divine purpose while delivering only trauma. For anyone observing, the lesson is clear. Power does not only act through force, it can survive in silence, in symbols, in repetition, in the rituals that shape thought itself. Thomas Blackwood's genius was not cruelty alone. It was the architecture of obedience, built to endure. When the FBI and medical teams arrived at the scattered properties in the 1970s, the reality was far darker than any report could have conveyed. They encountered adults in their 20s and 30s who had been raised in near-total isolation, conditioned to obey the invisible authority of a man long gone. Their existence was a testament to the precision, patience, and perverse intelligence of Thomas Blackwood. The first sighting was almost cinematic. A cluster of adults and teenagers moving in synchronized patterns within the wooded perimeters of a remote homestead in Tennessee. Their eyes betrayed wariness, fear, and an ingrained understanding that every action was observed, even if the observer was absent. The team quickly realized that these descendants had been taught an entire system of ritual, hierarchy, and duty that required no enforcement beyond memory and fear. Medical examinations confirmed the tragic physical consequences of Blackwood's experiments. Many exhibited facial deformities, stunted growth, and neurological impairments consistent with decades of inbreeding. Cognitive testing revealed intellectual delays, difficulties with abstract reasoning, and ritualized thought patterns. Yet even these deficits were accompanied by behaviors that were eerily precise: obedience, meticulous attention to detail, and the repetition of complex rituals that had been internalized as survival strategies. Investigators were confronted with a terrifying truth: Blackwood had succeeded in creating a living doctrine. The descendants themselves acted as carriers, guardians, and perpetuators of the ideology. The rules he had set decades prior were still followed with devotion, unquestioned obedience, and subtle reverence. A world observer might have dismissed it as superstition, but within this system, disobedience was unthinkable, and the doctrine endured without the patriarch's presence. Perhaps most disturbing were the interviews. When questioned about the outside world, many descendants expressed a visceral distrust, a fear of contamination, and a belief that obedience was sacred. Some still referenced instructions as though Blackwood were watching, reminding them of duties, purity, and divine purpose. In effect, The psychological chains he forged were as strong as any physical ones, perhaps stronger, for they were invisible, unbroken, and internalized. The 1970s investigation illuminated a grim reality. Control, fear, and ideology, once planted deep, can survive generations. Blackwood's experiment was no longer merely historical. It was living, breathing, and capable of replicating itself in unsuspecting communities, a testament to how one man's obsession could shape not just lives, but the very structure of thought, obedience, and identity. The rescue operations in the 1970s were like entering another world, one frozen in time, meticulously constructed, and terrifyingly obedient. Agents, social workers, and medical teams approached cautiously, knowing that they were not merely extracting people, but confronting a decades-old system of control that had been passed down, internalized, and weaponized against the human mind. The first encounters were chilling. Adults in their 20s and 30s emerged from wooded homesteads in rigid formation, eyes alert, posture defensive. Many had never seen outsiders beyond the occasional sanctioned visitor. They spoke in measured tones, carefully chosen words, often referencing duties they believed were divinely mandated. A simple greeting or gesture was met with hesitation, suspicion, or ritualized acknowledgement. Freedom was incomprehensible, terrifying even. Medical teams immediately noted the physical consequences of generations of isolation and inbreeding, stunted growth, congenital deformities, weakened immune systems, and chronic health conditions. Cognitive assessments revealed a landscape scarred by trauma, ritualized thought patterns, compulsive behaviors, and an inability to fully trust or interpret social cues. Yet despite these deficits, the descendants demonstrated astonishing precision in following the rules Blackwood had implanted, proof that his mental architecture had endured far beyond his physical presence. Psychologists documented an unsettling phenomenon, a dual reality within each person. One part of the mind instinctively obeyed internalized rules. The other struggled to navigate the foreign world of freedom and choice. Some broke down in tears, overwhelmed by unfamiliar stimuli and the shock of unstructured life. Others attempted to resist, only to revert instinctively to ingrained rituals or coded obedience. Freedom was not liberation. It was a confrontation with the weight of decades of programming. Social workers quickly realized that rescue required more than relocation. The descendants needed slow, deliberate exposure to autonomy, trust-building, and rehabilitation. Meals, clothing, communication, and sleep, all normal functions, had to be reintroduced carefully. Every interaction became a test of adaptability, patience, and the human mind's ability to unlearn decades of control. Yet even amidst the chaos, moments of resilience emerged. A few descendants began forming bonds, expressing curiosity, and tentatively exploring emotions beyond fear and obedience. They asked questions about the outside world, made choices, and began, painfully, to reclaim agency over lives that had been meticulously scripted since birth. It was here, in these first moments of contact, that the magnitude of Blackwood's experiment crystallized. He had not only created a bloodline, but a mental ecosystem of control capable of surviving decades, isolation, and even the death of its architect. And as the rescuers realized, undoing it would take a lifetime. Once the descendants were removed from isolation, the legal machinery of the state confronted a reality far more complex than anyone anticipated. These were not mere victims. They were carriers of a system of indoctrination, ritual, and obedience, shaped since birth to perpetuate the Blackwood doctrine. Yet many were too psychologically compromised to fully comprehend their participation, raising impossible questions about accountability, culpability, and justice. Courts faced an unprecedented dilemma. Adults who had, knowingly or unknowingly, continued aspects of Thomas Blackwood's practices were charged with crimes ranging from neglect to abuse. But many were legally incompetent to stand trial. Their minds were as controlled as any prisoners, conditioned to obey invisible authority. Lawyers, judges, and psychologists argued over the line between victim and perpetrator, highlighting a truth few were prepared to face. Indoctrination can erase agency as effectively as chains. The trial records are chilling in their clarity. Witnesses describe descendants performing rituals with the same precision their forebear had demanded decades earlier. Some testified in monotone, as though reciting scripture. Others appeared entirely detached, unable to process moral responsibility. Even forensic psychologists struggled to distinguish between indoctrination, compulsion, and volition. The law, designed to address human intent, was confronted with a system designed to remove it. Meanwhile, public reaction was a mixture of fascination, horror, and disbelief. Newspapers dubbed it America's most shocking experiment in isolation. But few grasped the subtlety of what had occurred. This was not a simple case of abuse. It was a deliberate construction of obedience, a multi-generational psychological manipulation that had reshaped minds, bodies, and morality. Generations had been trained to accept terror as duty, ritual as salvation, and control as love. Rehabilitation efforts began in parallel with the legal proceedings. Therapists and social workers worked tirelessly to untangle the web of fear, ritual, and coded obedience. Each small victory, self-expression, independent thought, emotional response, was monumental. Yet even as these individuals learned to navigate the outside world, the legacy of Blackwood persisted, a shadow cast over the present. In the end, the trials illuminated an unsettling reality. The most insidious crimes are not always the ones recorded in statutes. They are the ones embedded in thought, memory, and identity, passed silently from generation to generation. Thomas Blackwood had not only abused bodies, he had weaponized minds, creating consequences that stretched decades beyond his physical presence, leaving society to grapple with the moral, legal, and psychological fallout. Hidden behind false panels in the Blackwood farmhouse, investigators discovered journals that revealed Thomas Blackwood's mind in full. They were not simple diaries. They were blueprints for a system of control, a manifesto of delusion, and a meticulous record of what he saw as divine duty. Each page chronicled not just events, but calculations, hierarchies, and the step-by-step design of a lineage meant to survive a world he believed was doomed. The journals contained detailed accounts of each daughter's development, fertility, and compliance. Blackwood recorded behaviors, reactions to discipline, and responses to ritual with clinical precision. His entries oscillated between religious fervor and cold calculation, showing a man who believed himself chosen to enact God's will through blood and obedience. He documented which pairings produced superior offspring, noted weaknesses to be corrected, and outlined plans for the next generation. Even more disturbing were the entries describing his vision of an apocalypse. Blackwood believed that society outside the mountains was corrupt beyond salvation, that the world was doomed to collapse, and that only his purified bloodline could inherit the earth. His writing detailed scenarios of cataclysm, population collapse, and moral decay, all of which, he believed, justified his systematic isolation, breeding program, and psychological conditioning of his daughters. The journals also revealed his strategic manipulation of local authorities. Payments to sheriffs, donations to county funds, and subtle threats ensured that scrutiny never reached its full potential. Blackwood's meticulous records of bribery, intimidation, and compliance building reveal a man who understood power, both legal and psychological, and wielded it without mercy. Perhaps most chilling were the final entries. Even decades after relocating to multiple properties under assumed identities, Blackwood planned contingencies to ensure his doctrine survived. He recorded instructions for daughters and grandchildren to continue the lineage, enforce ritual, and maintain secrecy. The vision was not just of survival, it was of replication, a carefully orchestrated multi-generational strategy. The investigators realized they were confronting more than historical atrocity. They were reading the blueprint of a system designed to endure invisibly, a mental and moral architecture that would outlive its creator. Every page, every calculation, every note was a testament to a terrifying principle. Cruelty, when combined with structure, ritual, and ideology, can become immortal. The 1946 discovery of Thomas Blackwood's safety deposit box had hinted at something far larger than a single isolated family. When investigators traced the documents, they found a network of properties in Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina, each purchased under assumed identities, each serving as a node in his apocalyptic plan. These weren't merely homes, they were microcosms of the system he had perfected in West Virginia, replicated with eerie precision. Each property mirrored the original Blackwood estate, remote, fortified, and insulated from outside influence. Investigators documented identical layouts, secret rooms, and ritual spaces, confirming that Blackwood's obsessive attention to detail had been exported along with his ideology. The daughters and grandchildren who occupied these sites had been trained to maintain the same rituals, codes, and hierarchies. In effect, Blackwood had created multiple laboratories of obedience, each one reinforcing the other, and all designed to perpetuate his divine bloodline without interruption. The scale of the operation stunned authorities. Nearly 100 individuals, many of them children, had been raised entirely within Blackwood's doctrines. Physical and cognitive abnormalities were rampant, predictable consequences of generations of inbreeding, but the psychological imprint was even more pronounced. Every child had internalized a system of control, obedience, and ritual that aligned perfectly with the patriarch's original blueprint. Investigators were confronted with a terrifying realization. This was not an isolated atrocity, it was an ecosystem of control. Each family acted autonomously, yet remained synchronized in ideology. The network ensured that, even if one property was discovered or compromised, others could continue his work. Blackwood's design had achieved redundancy, resilience, and invisibility. Psychologists later observed that descendants from different properties communicated in subtle ways, coded phrases, ritualized gestures, and behavioral cues that echoed the training of West Virginia. Even without physical contact, the doctrine had spread like a virus, mental, behavioral, and cultural, across state lines. Blackwood had created an ideological contagion, invisible to the world, but potent enough to survive decades of scrutiny. It became clear that the 1946 discovery was not just a cold case, it was a warning. Systems of control, when constructed with obsession, precision, and foresight, do not end with the death or disappearance of the architect. They propagate, replicate, and endure, quietly influencing minds, families, and communities in ways most would never suspect. When the Blackwood descendants were removed from the properties, the first encounters with freedom were almost paradoxically terrifying. After decades of internalized control, rituals, and fear, autonomy was incomprehensible. Some clung to old routines, folding laundry in precise sequences, arranging food exactly as taught, or reciting prayers in codes learned by rote. Freedom to them was not liberation, it was chaos. Psychologists and social workers observed a pattern emerging among the older children and adults. A few began small acts of resistance, questioning instructions, delaying obedience, or experimenting with choices for the first time in their lives. These were minor gestures, selecting their own clothing, choosing meals, or speaking without ritualized cadence, but they represented monumental shifts in cognition and courage. Survivors described an internal struggle, the ingrained belief that disobedience was sinful, dangerous, or even deadly, conflicted with an instinctive curiosity about the outside world. Some experienced intense guilt for thinking independently, others oscillated between fear and exhilaration. Each act of defiance required immense psychological effort, as if breaking invisible chains that had been forged over decades. In private sessions, several descendants recounted vivid memories of secret planning within the household. They described whispering to each other, hiding small acts of defiance or questioning rituals quietly, a process almost unnoticed by older siblings but noticed by the more indoctrinated members. These micro-resistances were the first seeds of autonomy, proof that even in the most controlled environments, the human mind seeks freedom. Medical teams noted physiological responses to newfound autonomy, increased heart rates, elevated stress hormones, and sleep disturbances. Decision-making itself became a challenge as descendants were unpracticed in evaluating risk or choice without the guiding hand of Blackwood's rules. Rehabilitation was not just mental, it was a physical recalibration of bodies trained to respond to fear, ritual, and obedience. Yet even in this struggle, hope emerged. Slowly, some learned to recognize external reality, build trust with caregivers, and differentiate moral reasoning from ritualized obedience. These early victories were fragile, often reversed by relapses into ritual under stress, but they were evidence of the mind's resilience. Autonomy, once awakened, could grow, and in that growth lay the potential to break the cycle Thomas Blackwood had orchestrated for decades. One of the most insidious tools Thomas Blackwood left behind was language itself. Ritualized phrases, coded instructions, and secret utterances that governed thought, behavior, and identity. Descendants were trained to respond to these phrases instantly, without hesitation, as though hearing them triggered obedience deep within the psyche. Each phrase was a key, locking them into patterns of thought that had been meticulously constructed over decades. During rehabilitation, psychologists discovered that breaking these verbal chains was essential to restoring autonomy. Small tests involved asking descendants to repeat a phrase they had been trained to obey, then guiding them to reinterpret it or respond with personal choice. The results were profound. Some reacted with terror, a kind of cognitive dissonance so strong it triggered physical symptoms, tremors, nausea, even panic. Others showed subtle defiance at first, a hesitation that grew into understanding. The phrase no longer held power over them. The work required repetition, patience, and ritual in reverse. Therapists instructed survivors to say a symbolic phrase aloud, once, twice, transforming its meaning from obedience into affirmation of their own agency. The phrase acted as a bridge between worlds, the one Blackwood had controlled and the one they were reclaiming. Each repetition was a reclamation of thought, a declaration that identity was no longer dictated by fear. It was not just words, it was a cognitive revolution. The brain, conditioned for decades to obey invisible authority, began to rewire itself. Neural pathways forged by fear and ritual slowly decayed, replaced by circuits that allowed choice, curiosity, and moral reasoning. For many, uttering the phrase twice became a pivotal moment, a tangible act of self-liberation, one that could be repeated until autonomy became instinct rather than challenge. Even decades later, psychologists noted that this technique was essential for survivors to integrate into society. Without it, many remained trapped in micro-patterns of obedience, unable to process decisions, relationships, or morality independently. With it, small sparks of rebellion turned into sustained independence, and ritualized fear became memory instead of compulsion. The discovery revealed a critical truth. Control is not only enforced through chains or walls, it can be embedded in the very language people use, silently directing thought and action. And if language can imprison, language can also free, but only if you are willing to speak it, claim it, and repeat it until the spell is broken. The first moments the Blackwood descendants stepped into the outside world were surreal. Sunlight, wind, and open space were no longer abstract concepts. They were overwhelming realities, experienced for the first time without the filter of ritual or fear. Streets, vehicles, strangers, and even mundane sounds triggered reactions that ranged from awe to terror. For some, birdsong or the rustle of leaves was almost painful, a sensory overload they had never been trained to interpret. Psychologists observed striking behavioral contrasts between siblings. Older descendants, who had been trained as enforcers of Blackwood's doctrine within the household, initially sought structure even in unstructured environments. They would attempt to organize others, create rules, and enforce order, as though the chaos outside needed immediate control. Younger descendants, whose experience of ritual was less rigid, often reacted with curiosity and wonder, but lacked guidance for navigating freedom, sometimes wandering dangerously close to roads or engaging in behaviors considered unsafe. Communication was another battleground. Many had never spoken without purpose, obedience, or ritualized cadence. Casual conversation, joking, or expressing personal desire was initially impossible. They struggled to recognize sarcasm, metaphor, or subtle social cues, leaving them vulnerable to misunderstanding or manipulation. Yet small victories emerged: a smile, a shared joke, a simple choice of food or clothing. These were milestones, signaling not only adaptation, but the beginning of selfhood beyond Blackwood's shadow. Medical teams and social workers documented the physiological effects of transition. Sleep patterns had been dictated by ritual. Now, the mind and body struggled to recalibrate. Hunger, rest, and movement were sources of confusion, and even clothing was a challenge. Garments, previously dictated by hierarchy and function, now became personal expression. Every decision required conscious effort, exhausting the survivors mentally and emotionally. Yet within these struggles were the seeds of resilience. For the first time, descendants could imagine possibilities beyond the constraints of isolation. They began to explore relationships, form friendships, and most importantly, question the moral framework imposed by Blackwood. Each small act of curiosity, choice, or independent thought chipped away at the architecture of control, marking the slow but irreversible dismantling of a multi-generational system designed to dominate body, mind, and spirit. The world outside was terrifying, but it was also freedom, and freedom, once experienced, could never be fully taken away. Freedom did not erase fear. For the Blackwood descendants, the trauma of decades under Thomas Blackwood's control lingered like a shadow, infecting memory, perception, and emotion. Even after leaving the isolated properties, every new experience was filtered through a lens of suspicion, obedience, or guilt. Ordinary interactions, touch, conversation, or even eye contact could trigger panic as the mind unconsciously searched for hidden threats or authority figures. Therapists and social workers quickly realized that rehabilitation required more than physical relocation or basic care. It demanded painstaking emotional reconstruction. Survivors had to relearn trust, empathy, and moral judgment from scratch, often in small, measured doses. Relationships with caregivers were delicate experiments, built slowly on consistency, patience, and the repeated reassurance that autonomy was not only safe, but their inherent right. Yet trauma was only part of the challenge. Descendants carried internalized guilt, shame, and confusion. They questioned their own complicity in practices imposed upon them, struggling to differentiate between indoctrination and moral responsibility. Some believed they had betrayed siblings by escaping or accepting care. Others feared they would inevitably repeat patterns they had been taught. The weight of decades of manipulation made forgiveness, both of themselves and of others, an agonizingly slow process. Society itself faced dilemmas. Courts, medical institutions, and communities were unprepared to integrate individuals whose entire developmental framework had been constructed for secrecy, ritual, and obedience. Standard educational, social, and legal systems proved inadequate. For many survivors, the world was incomprehensible. Laws, norms, and expectations were abstract, arbitrary, and terrifying. Without specialized care, reintegration risked traumatization, exploitation, or regression into learned behaviors. Still, glimpses of resilience emerged. Survivors formed micro-communities with shared understanding, gradually reclaiming language, choice, and identity. With therapy, education, and mentorship, many began to reinterpret the past, not as permanent destiny, but as a framework from which they could rebuild. They learned to question authority, recognize manipulation, and reclaim agency that had been systematically stripped away. The legacy of Blackwood was not only visible in the physical and psychological scars of his descendants, it lingered in the ethical and practical challenges society faced when confronting a multi-generational system of control. One disturbing truth became clear: escaping tyranny is only the first step. The second, far more difficult, is learning how to live freely after decades of obedience and ensuring the cycle is never allowed to repeat. Thomas Blackwood's trail vanished almost as deliberately as his system had been constructed. After decades of orchestrating isolation, indoctrination, and clandestine expansion, the patriarch seemingly evaporated into the shadows he had mastered. The last confirmed record places him in rural Georgia in 1932, aged around 70. Beyond that, nothing. No sightings, no correspondence, no trace in official documents. He became a ghost, a presence defined by absence, leaving investigators and descendants alike with questions that would never fully resolve. The disappearance was neither accidental nor coincidental. Blackwood had spent decades perfecting the art of invisibility, multiple identities, hidden properties, financial subterfuge, and the silent obedience of his network. By the time authorities reached the last known location, he had already embedded contingencies to ensure continuity. Each daughter, each child, had been trained not just to obey, but to continue the work if their father were absent. His vanishing was the final act of a calculated, long-running performance of control. This absence created profound unease among survivors and investigators. The man responsible for generations of manipulation, incest, and psychological terror had never faced justice. Even after decades of investigation, the question remained: had he died quietly, unseen, blending into society under a new identity, or had he established another hidden enclave to continue his doctrine? Every lead ran cold, every clue dissolved into the possibility that Blackwood had engineered his own escape as meticulously as he had engineered his children's lives. The mystery amplified the psychological legacy. Descendants, though free from his direct control, lived with the haunting idea that the architect of their suffering could still exist, unaccountable and potentially observing. Law enforcement and historians alike acknowledge that unresolved absence magnifies fear. Unlike crimes solved or perpetrators caught, Blackwood's vanishing sustained a shadow of dread that even decades later could be felt across communities he touched. For society, it became a lesson in the limits of law, oversight, and human perception. A man could orchestrate a multi-generational system of control, manipulate officials, and vanish completely. Yet the consequences of his ideology would ripple for decades, even after intervention. Blackwood's disappearance was not the end of the story. It was an extension of the terror, a deliberate act to ensure that even in presumed death, his presence remained etched into the lives, minds, and fears of those he had shaped. The aftermath of Thomas Blackwood's system was not confined to immediate survivors. It rippled across genetics, psychology, and society in ways that would persist for generations. The multi-generational inbreeding he orchestrated left nearly 100 descendants with severe congenital disorders, cognitive impairments, and psychological scars that could not be undone. Physical anomalies, facial irregularities, stunted growth, and chronic illness were the visible marks of a lineage deliberately manipulated for purity. Yet the psychological consequences ran deeper. Survivors carried embedded codes of obedience, ritualized fear, and distorted morality. Even when removed from Blackwood's control, many struggled to differentiate coercion from personal choice, love from duty, curiosity from sin. Cognitive patterns imposed by decades of indoctrination left lasting imprints: decision paralysis, hypervigilance, ritualized behaviors, and susceptibility to authority figures. Therapy could assist, but the echoes of control remained embedded in the very architecture of their minds. Society itself bore the weight of these consequences. Court systems confronted unprecedented ethical dilemmas: how to hold individuals accountable for behaviors learned entirely under coercion. Medical institutions struggled with long-term care for those with congenital and cognitive disorders. Communities in West Virginia, Tennessee, Kentucky, and North Carolina found themselves hosting populations whose very existence was a testament to an ideology no one could fully comprehend, and no law had adequately anticipated. The broader lesson of Blackwood's legacy is stark. Systems of control, once perfected, extend far beyond immediate perception. They reshape biology, alter psychology, and leave communities grappling with effects decades later. Even after the discovery and rehabilitation efforts, the survivors' struggles illuminated uncomfortable truths about human vulnerability to manipulation. It was a case study in the catastrophic potential of concentrated, unchecked authority, the consequences of a single mind's obsession permitted to dominate generations. Researchers who studied the Blackwood bloodline emphasized that the impact was more than historical. It was an ongoing ethical and scientific challenge. Each descendant's recovery was partial, a compromise between autonomy and the unavoidable imprint of what they had been forced to endure. Generations would carry fragments of trauma, reminders of control so complete that even the act of surviving bore the shadow of the man who had orchestrated it all. In essence, Thomas Blackwood did not merely disappear from view, he embedded himself into DNA, memory, and community, a specter whose influence would echo long after the world believed his reign had ended. The Blackwood story is not just a relic of the past. It is a mirror reflecting the vulnerabilities that still exist in modern society. Isolation, unchecked authority, and manipulation are not confined to the Appalachian Hills of the early 20th century. Anywhere a single figure can consolidate control through fear, ideology, or secrecy, there lies the potential for systematic abuse. Blackwood's case teaches that power, when concentrated and unchallenged, becomes a weapon against both mind and body. Psychologists studying the Blackwood descendants emphasize the enduring nature of trauma. Even decades later, the survivors' coping mechanisms and worldview were shaped by fear and obedience. This has profound implications for understanding modern abusive systems, familial, institutional, or corporate, where control may be subtler but no less destructive. Trauma can be inherited, not just culturally, but biologically, altering stress responses and mental health for generations. Blackwood's experiment demonstrates the dark potential of systematic manipulation when left unchecked. For society, the lesson is sobering. Laws and oversight are insufficient if corruption, bribery, or fear prevent intervention. Blackwood's wealth and influence effectively silenced officials, delaying justice for decades. Today, similar patterns play out in hidden abuses across institutions, often shielded by bureaucracy, loyalty, or silence. The echoes of this case demand vigilance. Communities, authorities, and individuals must recognize that inaction can perpetuate cycles of suffering. Moreover, the Blackwood lineage highlights the ethical complexities of intervention. When survivors are discovered, society faces a dual responsibility: protect and rehabilitate, while acknowledging the limits of what can be undone. Healing is neither simple nor complete. Yet it is necessary because the alternative is allowing the architecture of control to persist unchallenged in subtle forms that may go unnoticed until the damage is irreversible. This story also serves as a psychological warning. Every act of obedience without questioning, every acquiescence to authority without accountability carries potential consequences, both personal and societal. Blackwood's life reminds us that tyranny can hide behind devotion, secrecy, and ideology. Recognizing and resisting manipulation is not merely a moral exercise, it is a survival imperative. The shadows of the past are never fully gone. They linger in DNA, in culture, in memory, and in the vigilance of those who choose to see, understand, and act. The Blackwood case is a lesson etched in horror, but also in warning. Awareness is power, and inattention can be fatal. Even after rescue, even after rehabilitation, freedom did not erase the shadow of Thomas Blackwood. The descendants faced a lifetime of negotiation with the past, each day a struggle to reconcile the world they were thrust into with the world they had been forced to inhabit. Some adapted, learning skills, forming relationships, and slowly constructing identities independent of fear. Others remained trapped in subtle patterns of obedience and ritual, echoes of the multi-generational control that had shaped every thought, action, and desire. Medical and psychological assessments revealed enduring fractures, cognitive impairments, chronic anxiety, dissociation, and in several cases, inability to maintain employment or form conventional families. Social reintegration was uneven. Some survivors flourished in supportive environments, while others struggled endlessly. These realities made it painfully clear that liberation, while necessary, was incomplete. The human mind, once meticulously conditioned over decades, does not easily return to normalcy. Yet resilience persisted. Some descendants became activists, educators, and counselors, determined to prevent even a fraction of what had occurred from happening again. Their lives, though scarred, became living testaments to survival and adaptation. The Blackwood legacy, horrifying as it was, also offered insight into the human capacity to endure, and the moral imperative to intervene when systems of abuse are hidden from view. Still, the question of Thomas Blackwood's ultimate fate lingered like a curse. His absence, unresolved and deliberate, perpetuated fear that some fragment of his ideology might survive, dormant or active. Communities across 4 states carried a quiet vigilance, aware that the machinery of secrecy and manipulation could always re-emerge in new forms. For the descendants, this uncertainty was a constant reminder that freedom is never absolute. It is negotiated, maintained, and guarded. The Blackwood case remains one of the most extreme examples of multi-generational control, isolation, and abuse in modern American history. It is not just a story of horror. It is a study of power, obedience, and the human mind's vulnerability to manipulation. For those willing to look, it offers a harsh but invaluable lesson. Tyranny thrives in silence, secrecy, and unchallenged authority, and vigilance, awareness, and action are the only defenses against it. In the end, survival became both a blessing and a burden. The descendants were free, but freedom, once achieved, was only the beginning of reclaiming humanity, piece by fractured piece. The Blackwood saga ends not with closure, but with a haunting question. How does one measure the cost of a life shaped by terror, obedience, and isolation? The descendants, now scattered and rehabilitated, carry scars invisible to the casual observer. Scars embedded in memory, in DNA, and in the very architecture of their minds. Their survival is remarkable, yet incomplete. Freedom was earned, but the shadow of a father's tyranny stretches across generations, a silent echo that cannot be erased. Historians, psychologists, and investigators alike agree on one undeniable truth. Thomas Blackwood achieved something nearly impossible. He created a self-contained system of control so sophisticated, so ruthless, that it persisted despite external laws, moral outrage, and time itself. His influence transcended mortality, embedded into behavior, thought, and biology. In that, there is a lesson darker than any tale of horror. The human mind is both vulnerable and resilient, and unchecked authority can imprint itself across generations in ways that defy reckoning. Even now, decades after the final discoveries, the story continues to resonate. Communities remain wary, investigators still study the networks he left behind, and psychologists dissect the lessons his descendants impart about trauma, indoctrination, and recovery. The case is a warning, an unflinching reminder that secrecy, control, and ideology, when allowed to flourish, can create horrors hidden in plain sight. And most chilling of all, the architect of it all may never have been caught, leaving open the terrifying possibility that some fragment of his design persists, dormant but alive. To confront this story is to confront the fragility of human freedom and the power of deliberate manipulation. It is a call to vigilance, to questioning, to the relentless pursuit of truth, even when society prefers silence. The Blackwood family, though finally uncovered, reminds us that evil does not always announce itself, and history often buries its darkest lessons beneath polite fiction and ignorance. So as you leave this story behind, carry one truth with you. The world is shaped not only by those who act, but by those who watch, obey, or remain silent. Awareness is not optional. It is the shield that separates survival from subjugation, insight from indoctrination, and freedom from the quiet tyranny that can persist unnoticed for decades. The Blackwood legacy is terrifying, but it is also a warning. And now, having seen it, you know it exists.